let's take a look at the MVC application framework in Visual Studio. So when you're looking at this video, it's important that you realize my version of Visual Studio, because this tends to change in terms of what templates are available and sort of the semantics or the use of the names of the different templates in MVC that Microsoft provides. So I'm using the Visual Studio Community Edition 2017, and this is my version 15.9.4. And when you create a new MVC project, the one that we'll be looking at when you click on New Project, it will be under the Visual C# .NET Core, and we're looking at this one right here called this ASP.NET Core Web Application. If you look at its description over here, it provides core applications for Windows, Linux, Mac OS using the .NET Core or .NET Framework for Razor Pages, MVC, Web API, or single page applications. So that's the specific template that we'll be using, and I'm just going to call mine Web App Test 2 because I've already got one that I'm working on here, and I just want to show you what happens right here when you launch it. And when you do that, you'll be given an opportunity to choose, as you get more familiar with the MVC framework, you will not need to necessarily launch this template where it sort of creates the folders for you, the files, does a lot of the work for you, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Some developers prefer to start with an empty template and build the objects and, in other words, the model view controllers as they see fit. You'll also notice that there's this ASP.NET Core version. I've got Core 2.1 and Core 2.2. It's important for you to observe what version of the ASP.NET Core you're using, and that may affect things if you're collaborating with other developers on your project, when you're publishing your work. So in this course we typically use GitHub, and when your teammates on your development project collaborate, it's important that you're all working on the same ASP.NET Core version. So make note of that. And once you do that, you'll have some options here. We won't go over Docker support. In some versions of Visual Studio, older versions, I don't know that they have this checkbox available to support or configure HTTPS. You can uncheck that just for learning purposes. There's also this authentication, different choices here depending on how you're wanting to deploy the application on a network. We'll just, for learning purposes, use the no authentication. And when you launch this, it takes those basic configuration settings in mind based on those choices of the .NET Framework and choices of collaboration. And so by doing that, we'll go over what we see here, but just launching this, at least in my version of Visual Studio, when you launch this template, so depending on the version of Visual Studio, you'll have your presentation of the app by the template will look slightly different. So Visual Studio comes with a version of IIS, that's Microsoft's web server, and it has an Express edition that allows you to launch web applications, and they can be, after being compiled, they can be interpreted by the web server and displayed in the browser on a random port here. So you see here it's launching on my local laptop on a random port 64402. So depending on when you're working on it, this port could be different. Each time I launch, that port could be different. Again, it's just a random assignment by Visual Studio for the IIS Express edition. And you can see here it provides some navigation, really not much here, but again, no coding. And we have down here, you can see also there's this 2019 copyright. So the CSS, all of the basic bones of a .NET, ASP.NET web application. In this case, we're also using the C# template that allows us to compile the C# language inside of the MVC application. So I just wanted to show you that, and then moving further, let's look at just a couple of real basics here. I have got one already started. I just want to show you a couple of things that I've done. I guess we can go back to this very briefly, and then we'll go over to the one that I've got some work done. So looking at this one I just created, we've got these 3 folders, and this is where the MVC name comes from. So we have the models folder, the views folder, and the controllers folder. So by definition, this is what we mean by model view controllers. So I've got this text document that I put here to display it for those that want to see a description. So when we talk about models, we're talking about in the application working with data structures or data and all of the business logic. And so we also have the presentation layer of any application where the user is using a user interface and they're interacting with the application, they're looking at data, they're looking at visual representations of the data or interface components like text boxes, buttons, and so forth. And then we have the controllers, and this is where user actions get executed and the control flows of the application, sort of the movements of the application, the actions. Let's take a look at each of these folders. So again, that's where we get MVC, models, views, controllers. And the way that Visual Studio organizes that framework inside this template is it creates 3 folders, and we have models, views, and controller folders. When we look at each of these folders, the views, we have 2 subfolders. One is called home, and this is any essentially web views or views that are shared with the home page. And then you have shared, which these can be viewed throughout the application, and you'll see some of these differences as you begin to explore this. But it's important that you realize that view has a parent folder, and then there are some subfolders that you can further. So for instance, from the home page here, we can view the index, and by default, IIS interprets the index page as the very first page that it launches, unless you otherwise configure it to launch a different page when the web page is launched from essentially whatever is identifying the domain name of the URL, the resource. It will go directly and point to the index page unless otherwise configured. When we look here at the models, we don't have much to look at right now. We just have this error view model CS, and you notice that these .cs is the C#, the typical class files if you're familiar with working with C# and its object-oriented programming languages. You'll notice that the .cs extension is what we use to work with C# files. We also, under the controllers, we have this home controller.cs. And so if we just open that file here in our editor, this looks very familiar if you are familiar with C#. And so let's now dive in a little bit closer at, I've got another project that I took this default and changed the code a little bit. So right here, if we look from the top, we have a lot of directives. So we have this using.system. Notice that they're grayed out. Really the only one we're using is this line 6 using Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.MVC, at least in this app right here. So whenever you see these grayed out, that means that we're not using those. So if your application is not going to use these directives, it's best practice to just get rid of them. I'm just going to leave them there for now, just for the purposes of learning this template a little bit. When we look down here, we see this namespace, and really that's what we ended up naming our web app. So this one was web app underscore T1, and just like you've seen in maybe C# projects where the project solution gets named, the class, excuse me, the namespace gets named the same as the project. And then underneath here, under the namespace, we've got the class right here, the public class. And so we see this home controller is inherited right here. This controller is inherited from the home controller. So this home controller right here is part of the controller right here. So we already are seeing the inheritance right here. So if we hover over that, the base class for MVC controller with view support, when we hover over that. So that's our base class. And we've got right now this home controller. Notice that's the same name as our CS file. It is inherited from the base class controller. Okay? So that's what we've got here in this naming convention. Inside that, we have some methods. And right here, when we want to render a view, we can, right here, you'll see some other code. For instance, this was the code that came up in this newer version of the template where when it's trying to access a view, you see this return view, and then you return the view from the views folder. So this views method tells the controller to go to the views right here and find the method name is the same name as the file, the CSHTML file that's sitting inside of the views with the subfolder home. So the method is the same name as the file. Okay, and then this return view says return from the views this index file .cs, and you'll see here we create a new view file right here under this views homes, and you'll see that in just a moment. So anyway, that's what we mean here. And an easy way to start out, honestly, is comment out all of the code that comes with your template. Okay, so for instance, if I just take this code right here, and I'm going to go to our clean version right here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment out all of the code that accessed right there the view. And so the only thing that I've got is the namespace and the class with this open curly brace, close curly brace. So it really doesn't do anything right now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in right here this method that's going to return a view. And so the syntax that we can do that with, just to demonstrate, and what I'm telling it to do is execute this view method in my view, and you're going to see a problem with that, because over here when it goes in, it won't be able to find my view. So let's see what happens. This helps you sort of go through the mental process of what's happening with this MVC framework. So as it runs IIS, it says, hey, wait a minute. The my view was not found. And it looked inside these folders. So look, it looked in the views folder. It looked in home, and it said, did it find myview.cshtml? No, it didn't find it. It looked then in the shared folder. it could not find the file. It also looked in a folder called Pages and Shared, and it could not locate it. So this really tells the story of how MVC, how these controllers locate the views, and this is where it looked. It could not find that file. So we'll come back to that in just a moment, and I'm going to get another piece of code here. And what we're going to do here is, instead of accessing these views, I'm going to more or less, for lack of a better way of saying it, just hard code some text to the screen. So I'm going to put inside of my controller method here, and I'm going to have it return. I have a method here called index, and all I wanted to do is return a string that says hello world. Now let's look and see what happens here. In this case, I'm not going after that view result. I'm not calling an actual view inside the MVC framework. You notice here it just says hello world in the browser. So it did not do anything fancy. It just essentially printed hello world as text in the browser. It didn't actually access any resource inside of my views here. So let's go back and let's get this code here again, and let's replace it. Let's really leverage our MVC framework. So here again, we're looking for a view called my view, and it's going to look inside of the views in the home, or it's also going to look in this shared directory. So in this home directory, we're going to right click and we're going to add a new item right here, and under the ASP.NET Core, under web, we go to ASP.NET. Right here it says Razor View. Now if you had an older version of Visual Studio, it might say something like MVC View Page. In this case, Microsoft has deprecated that terminology, and they're just using Razor View Page here instead of this MVC View Page. And what we do is it's going to create a .cs HTML file, and I'm just going to call it my, and then capital IEW, myview.cs HTML. Click add. And once that adds it, you will see right here the my view CS HTML file show up, and there's no code in this. And so this, when you see this sort of @ symbol with open close curly brace, that's the code block that allows you to call Razor, which is really the rendering, sort of a rendering engine for views in ASP.NET. And so I can just tell it layout equals null, and that really, what that does is just this, you know, there's nothing really here that's going to return for the layout method or the layout object, which has a get and set property from the Razor pages, and we don't want it to use any particular layout. And so all I'm going to do is run this, and the idea here is that you don't see an error. So when we run this, it should just really show nothing. And there's the amazing nothing with no there's no text, there's no content, it's just a blank page. But the key point here is that there's no error included in the information. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to take some HTML code that I've written here in this version of my view, and this is just some basic HTML, saving some time of typing here. I'm just going to put it in there. And so all we've got here is just your typical HTML open close tags. We've got the head is going to display in the title tag the index file, and so all this is going to display is in the body of the content hello world from the view. And so I can build this code, and then I'm going to run it right here. So I have a succeeded build, and this time let's see what happens. It will find my view inside of the home folder of the views root and display some content. So this time it says hello world, and then I just put from the view so that you could see it is rendering content from a CSHTML file right here under the views home folder. Now let's look at a little bit more of a dynamic example. It's common in web application programming that our application must be dynamic in some way. It responds to information. So what we've got here, going back to my previous work, right here, let's go back to our home controller. I've written here another method, version, and let's take a look at what we're doing here. So then I'm going to come over here to my home controller, and let's just comment out that version. We've got a new version. Let's take a look at what we're doing here. So again, we're accessing the view here, the index. We're going to return my view. Right here, we're going to return my view. Let's see what we're doing here. Now, up here, before we were only using the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.MVC objects in the .NET framework. Now all of a sudden we're going to access this a system object, which is why this is no longer gray. It's brighter blue and a darker black. And what we're doing here is we initialize a variable, we declare an integer variable, and we get the hour from the date time object. So we get the current time that's based on our system clock. So if you look at my system clock, it's 5:21 p.m. And we get the hour from the current time. And then what we do is we have this view bag right here. And what view bag is, it's a dynamic object. This view bag is available as a dynamic object within the MVC framework, to which you can assist any arbitrary property. And that's, should have just brought this comment over from the old, and we'll put this over here in our new, and just want to put that there so that we properly recognize that that's what we're doing here. Is we have this view bag object available to us in ASP.NET applications from the framework that we're using here in MVC, where we right here, what we're doing is we just assign, right now this property was not available at all to this application. So we just made up a property from view bag called greeting. So it's not available anywhere else in our program. We just now are declaring it at this moment. So we've got this arbitrary dynamic object available to us called view bag. And we just create a property on the fly called greeting, and then we give a value right here. We give some logic actually, and what we're saying is, if the hour is less than 12, okay, so that's our test here. If hour is less than 12, then we have right here two possible conditions. If that tests to true, then assign the string good morning to that property. Else assign the good afternoon. In other words, it's 12 or greater comes back as the integer value of the hour. And then all we're going to do then is return my view, and the result right here of this object will be displayed as right here. It will be displayed, this string, one of these two strings will be displayed within this view. And so wait, so how do we call this method? So because right now we just, in our my view CSHTML, all we've got is this hello. So I'm just going to comment out, we've got some more work to do. In case you didn't know how to do comments in HTML, it's just this right here. This is the syntax for a comment. So it's less than, explanation, dash dash, and then dash dash, greater than. So I've got some code already that I've written in my first example in my view, and this is what I do to call that method from that view bag object that I created. Let's look at what I'm doing. So from this is the power of this framework. From my view, under here, under views home, in my view.cshtml, I can call that view bag object because the controller right here is returning my view. And when it returns my view, this is available, this property from this view bag object is available to the my view.cshtml. And so all I do is just call that right here with this @ character view bag, and then dot the name of the property. So again, that's a property right here. It's just an arbitrary property right there, and it returns that. And I just do space and then world and then from the view. So this is just a string that's going to be displayed to the screen. So whatever is returned by the view bag object, the greeting property right here, which is either going to be this string or this string, right? It's going to go into this property, and we're going to render that, call this property from this view method, from my view. So let's see what happens when we run that. And it should say good afternoon world from the view. So there it is, good afternoon. And again, good afternoon was generated as a result of the view bag object and the greeting property. And that's really just the basics of MVC. There's a whole lot more that obviously we could cover in this video, but I just wanted to have you get a fundamental understanding of the model view controller concept. Specifically, we looked at controllers and views, and we can go over models a little more in depth in another video.